This podcast is brought to you by the Association for Coaching, a leading international professional body advancing coaching in business and society worldwide. I'm your host, Felicity Dwyer. I'm a coach, facilitator, trainer, and author of Crafting Connection. In this series, I'm delighted to introduce you to coaches and educators who bring their expert and varied perspectives to the theme of working with the whole person in coaching. We'll explore psychological frameworks and practical approaches that can help you increase your impact as a coach. In this episode with Beena Sharma, we discuss polarity thinking. Polarity thinking is not about opposites. Beena explains how it's a critical cognitive skill linked to vertical development and maturity thinking. We explore how wisdom can show up in resistance and why polarity thinking is so important for coaches and applicable across all coaching frameworks. Beena also shares some of the key polarities that you might experience in the way you show up as a coach, as well as ways to bring polarity thinking into your work with clients. I hope you enjoy the episode. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Beena Sharma. Beena's president of the Vertical Development Academy, and she's an international consultant with 32 years' experience in working with individual, team, and organisational learning. Beena is a master coach in leadership maturity coaching and a lead facilitator and certifying authority in VEDA's Coach Certification Programme. She's trained in multiple methodologies and frameworks in the areas of leadership and organisational change, including training at the master level in polarity thinking, which is the subject of our conversation today. Beena has made a unique contribution to integrating polarity thinking with vertical development to help people develop greater maturity and the ability to operate in a complex world. And I'm truly delighted to welcome you to the podcast, Beena.
Thank you so much, Felicity. This is wonderful because it's one of my favorite things to do, which is really explore polarities and hope to infect whoever I'm in conversation with the fascination around this topic, which is such a central human process. It's probably the most important thing I've learned in my life. And it's the most interesting in a way, because it's not just conceptual. Like the other frameworks that I use, they are framing reality in a particular way. And then there are tools and practices. But polarity thinking is actually the way we make sense itself. And it can be used as a framework to understand what is going on inside an individual, between individuals, in a small group, in a team, and in the whole system. So I just find it endlessly interesting, and it's ever fresh for me.
Thank you, Beena. And I came across polarity thinking through taking some courses with you, and I thought it was such an interesting idea and something I want to learn more about. So I was really, really thrilled that you were able to come here and hopefully just share a little about this topic with coaches and those interested in coaching. So we're going to look, if you're willing, at what is polarity thinking, and then go on perhaps to think a little bit about how coaches might be able to integrate some of the ideas into their practice.
Yeah, sure.
So my first question is the simple one, which will probably take a fair bit of exploration and unpicking in our time today. And that is, what is polarity thinking?
First of all, I want to say that polarity thinking is very intimate in everybody's experience. It's not something new. And when you said you found this to be so interesting, I would say it's different from an interesting idea out there that seems like, oh, there's lots of things that are possible with this idea. And between that kind of interest and interesting in the way I already relate to it, in the way that I already understand that it connects with something that I already know. That's really important because everybody that comes into learning about polarity thinking is already a resource because they know what it's about, except that it's not really conscious and it's not explicit. And so it's exciting to make it explicit, to begin to say, yeah, I know that. Yes, that happens to me. Yes, I've had that experience. And oh, I didn't realize that that same thing was happening in this situation where I was struggling. So that's what I find interesting to call out even before talking about polarities. So the way I say that everybody is already familiar with it is because it comes to us in different ways. And there are some terms you've heard and we've all heard. We don't hear them as polarities, but we hear them in terms of trade-offs. We need to trade off. So we know that there are two things and you got to let something go and you got to keep something. Or you can hear it as a compromise where you have to let something go and keep something. So those are sort of in some ways, the difficulty that we experience when there are tensions and we have to make choices. And we are ingrained to make either or choices because we're educated in it's either right or wrong, or it's either this or that. So that's part of our acculturation through the educational process, through society, and very important for us to exercise that discernment, this or that. So that's very important. However, when that becomes a conditioning and a programming where everything is seen from an either or, that's not reality, because reality is not just this or that. That's not what's actually happening. There are many things happening at the same time, and we need to be able to see them all. But we'll start with two. So sometimes polarities come to us using the framing of it's a false choice. What does that mean? It's a false choice, meaning you can't choose this or that. You need to choose both. Or sometimes we say, oh, that's complementary. So we recognize that this other thing, which seems to be different or seems to be the opposite, is actually supporting or is complementary. So these are all hinting at what we are calling polarities. So now if I were to simply say the definition of a polarity, I would say that a polarity is where there are two values, two things, two strengths, two goals, two aspects, two energies, two anything in a way that are both needed over time for a thriving and functional self and system. So when two things are in tension and you struggle with, should it be this or that? Should I, as a leader, should I be firm or should I be flexible? And at some point in time, as we become mature, we realize it's not this or that. But we can all recognize a time in our life where we decided one was better than the other. And some people decide it's better to be firm, and they are seen as very clear, directive leaders. And there are some people who've decided early on that it's better to be adaptive. It's better to be flexible. It's better to flow. And they are seen as adaptive leaders. The difficulty is that the tendency is to think that one is better than the other. And that's not so, because we realize when we pick one, so let's take firm and flexible. If I'm a firm leader, if I'm firm all the time and I'm not flexible. So this is the core of the polarity issue, where we tend to overdo something because we think it's better, then more is better. And always doing that is better. So we always do that. And then we say that that's me. Then we define ourselves and we somewhat fix ourselves that I'm the directive type. You know, we make it a type and we think it can't be changed and that it's sort of a groove in the universe or in my universe, you know. So if you're too firm, then you'll end up being seen as rigid because you're not flexing. And if you take the other view of the other leader that decides it's better to be adaptive and then they want to flex every time, then they're seen as wishy-washy, or they might be seen as lacking a backbone or lacking a spine. We have words. We have lots of words for people who tend to neglect something that we think is of value. So that leader may be seen as a wimpy leader, but in their mind, they are being adaptive. But what they're missing is what is needed sometimes to be firm and to be clear and to be decisive and to be directive. So good leadership is about doing both. So it's not either firm or flexible, it's firm and flexible. And so replacing the either or thinking with and which is the both and thinking, is really the skill. It's the key. It's the cornerstone of becoming an adept in polarity thinking. And it's so simple. And we all know that because throughout our growing years and our adult years, we have done that both and thinking. We have managed it. We've managed our work. We've managed our life. Work-life balance was the first explicit polarity that was called out in the work world when there was over focus on work and people's personal lives and family lives were suffering. So it became a thing. I think that was the first time, at least, I became conscious in retrospect of when a polarity became actually a practice for organizations and it was a value that organizations supported. So just like work-life balance, there are, I would say, innumerable things that are out of whack. And by understanding where it's a polarity and where we need to be integrating, I think is a key to just being more masterful. And therefore, the implications of coaching are huge. When you're coaching a leader and you begin to notice when they're doing either or thinking, what they need to be embracing, that they are neglecting, or that's sort of gone in the shadow, or that they cannot embrace because they worry or they fear the downside of that. Like, I'm a firm leader and I can't be flexible because people will think I'm wimpy. You see that? So we interpret the other pole that we don't like so much. We interpret that in terms of the negative, in terms of the downside. So I've said quite a lot. There are lots of people sort of embedded in what I've said. So the polarity is this dance between two poles that are both positive. They both are needed. And our capacity to masterfully dance with them and integrate them is what polarity thinking is about.
Thank you. So polarity thinking, got this image of this dance between the two poles. And something that I thought was interesting when I came across polarities was this idea that they're both positive. So they're both potentially strengths and they both potentially can be overused and then become out of whack, as you say. If the being strength or strong or decisive as a leader is overused, it can become authoritarian. If the ability to be flexible and adaptable is overused, it can make it hard to make decisions. So I can see how that dance works. And the other thing that I think is really key in what you said is that shift from either or choices to both and thinking, and perhaps making that a bit more explicit. And you talked a little bit about this already is integrated in what we do, but perhaps we haven't necessarily seen it, or we see it perhaps in some contexts and not in others.
Yeah. And I would want to emphasize the word over-focus that you used. So inherently, there's no problem with being firm. Inherently, there's no problem with being flexible. There's wisdom in both. But it's only when you over-focus that you get into the downside. So the both and mind can see how they are both positive and needed. But the either or mind, what that mind does is it creates an opposite where one is good and the other is bad. So either I'm firm or I'm wimpy. Or from the other point of view, either I'm adaptive or I'm rigid. So this is really important to understand that these opposites, they're not polarities. They're just the opposite, the negative opposite, when you over-focus on it. So now you can begin to see that there's some nuance in making sure that you're clear about what the polarity is and how are you framing it so that you have an opportunity to be more integrated. If I say I have to decide between being firm and wimpy, I'm never going to go to the wimpy side because who wants to be wimpy? Nobody. Was that clarifying that one point that I was wanting to make?
Yes, it does. And I want to pick up on something you talked about, which was the either or mind or the both and mind, because I'd love to hear a little bit more about those two minds.
Yeah. And here, maybe I could bring in a little bit about vertical development, which is the work I do in coaching. So coaching for people to understand how they have evolved and matured over time. And what does that even mean? So we all have a good sense of what is a more mature way of looking at things or what is not such a mature. We all have good experiences, good examples. We remember when we were in a difficult situation or a difficult conversations, we walked away thinking, well, that wasn't the right way for that person to have been. We all have that experience. And we all have the opposite experience where we're sitting with somebody or they deal with a situation and we walk away thinking, wow, that was really enlightening. That was really a much better way of dealing with it. So in very simple terms, we have an idea of what is more mature and less mature. And so vertical development basically describes the levels of maturity that human beings go through as life teaches them what's real as opposed to what they think is real or what we think should be happening and not be open to what is actually happening. So research shows that at earlier stages of this maturity development, there is more mechanical thinking and more either-or thinking. So in the assessment that we have, it shows that people will say it's either this or that, or they'll push towards one thing saying this is great and that is terrible. It's very obvious. We have strong addictions and allergies. But as we become more mature, more developed, then we begin to realize that this is not all good and this is not all bad. It's not black or white. And we first say it's gray, but then we begin to understand what gray is by understanding the nuance. And so we realize that it's both. Life is both. So was that clear enough? Do you want an example?
I'd love an example. And my understanding from what you said is that part of vertical development, part of maturing as people is that we bring more both and thinking. We're more able to see the nuance in a situation rather than always seeing things as black and white.
Yes, absolutely. I feel that's the critical cognitive skill, capability, competence, capacity. It's the critical thing that determines maturity as well. So the more you can do that, the more capable you are of handling complexity, of handling change because you're not too stuck, of handling conflict because you begin to see the other side, you begin to see other perspectives, of handling chronic issues, things that are long-standing, they begin to loosen because you can begin to shift how you think about it. And even cross-cultural issues, differences in culture. When an organization acquires another company or merges with another company, the values that are upheld by the other company become more obvious in contrast to our own values. And they appear to be, oh, that culture is very different. For example, they might be an adaptive culture. And we might be a very decisive culture. And when you see that in that context, then you begin to think, oh, they are not clear. They're just all over the place. And that begins to be seen as a bad thing. But when you do both and thinking, you can begin to see the potential of a more integrative culture where now you have a new entity that can embrace what we bring and what they bring. And it's a more integrative culture. So I think just in that one context, polarity thinking can make or break integration.
So you gave an example there at an organizational level of perhaps bringing two cultures after a merger. We've talked a little bit, and we might talk a little bit more about the individual level and how, we can bring different aspects into our own thinking, whether that's as leaders or any other roles we play in life. And also, this may be beyond the scope of this podcast, but it strikes me that in wider society as a whole, there's never been a greater need for this kind of thinking because of some of the divisions and polarities that exist. So it strikes me that this is really, really important for our times, for our complex times.
Yeah. And I might, if it's okay, to actually include that in our scope.
Yeah.
Simply because in a way, that's another polarity, we might say, is that we might think that this is for coaches and it's for leaders, and it's really not about the world at large. And so we are focusing on this, and we are intimately interdependent and interconnected with the world at large. And I might even go further to say that if coaches don't coach their clients to keep in mind how they impact the world at large, then we're doing a disservice. So I would say that it is within the scope of this conversation because also it's the topic, right?
Yeah.
So what are the key polarities, if you think about it just for a moment, that have gotten us into such a huge, what we call meta crisis, where so many different crises are compounding each other. And now it's one big meta crisis. And you can trace the lack of polarity thinking that has been a generative function of the meta crisis. So when you focus on only the part and not on the whole, if you focus only on your part, only your context, or you focus only on the local, not on the global, not on the whole system, then you will come up with solutions that serve the part and don't serve the system. So that's out of whack. And if you look at the human being as the part and the nature as the whole, on all of nature, or the planet as the whole, we've over-focused on what we need for humanity. We need more housing, we need more construction, we need resources. So it has become extractive. Now, there's no problem with extracting if we are also renewing. But if we are not taking care of renewal, if we are not taking care of nature, if we are not making sure that there is a balance, that we maintain the ecological balance, then we will end up in the environmental crisis, short term and long term. If you're only thinking short term, we're not thinking about 100 years hence, what kind of future are our children going to inherit? If we are only thinking about the intent we have and not about the impact we are creating, then we are going to be creating all kinds of externalities that may be harmful for us. So at the root of the meta crisis is the lack of polarity thinking. And therefore, it's so significant.
I think that's fantastic. Expanding the scope. That's brilliant. And I think it was, it might have been Barry Johnson. I saw a video about environment and finance. And this might not have been the question, but this is the question that's coming up now, is how can we look after the planet, the environment, and ensure people have what they need to live comfortably? And it is so much either or in the political thinking, certainly a lot of the political thinking we have now, and we need to be asking those bigger questions.
Yes, and also in connection with what's emerging. So these are known long-standing issues. The environmental climate crisis is not a new issue. It's been there for decades, But what's emerging, let's look at what's emerging. AI is emerging. That's the big topic. And the way AI is being implemented is this great multiplier of productivity tech solution. And so if we understand polarities, then we ought to be already thinking there's productive AI. What about responsible AI? So there's a lot of work being going on, of course, also in ethics and AI, but not enough, not in the larger population. There's not enough of a discourse on what is responsible AI. And what about the tech solutions and social innovation that is needed for the tech solutions to be wholesome and not to be harmful? So we're focusing on technology. We're not focusing on the social, the interior, the collective. So I think polarity thinking guides us in anticipating, even when some things are emerging that are new, it guides us in thinking about what's that other thing that we also need to be paying attention to. And sometimes we can't think about it, but there are enough signals that come as reactions. People who push away, push back, they represent some wisdom because they're pushing back because they are imagining that there's going to be some harm or some difficulty. So then it's our responsibility to explore that. And that's why in polarity thinking, we say there's wisdom in resistance. And one could also say it's a theory of resistance.
Can you say a little more about that? The theory of resistance? I mean, I can understand, I can see the wisdom, because if there's a societal push in one direction or a technological push, then that can provide another perspective. But can you say a little bit more about this?
Sure. Let's take an organizational example. Let's say an organization is experiencing the difficulty in being very siloed, being very bureaucratic, and everything is top down, which is typical, right? That's a vertical structure, a pyramid structure. And that is dysfunctional after some time. I mean, there's wisdom in a centralized top-down structure because you get speed, you get efficiency, you get economies of scale, etc. But you don't get autonomy, you don't get people more engaged. So I'll just do this in a short way. There are so many more examples I could give in connection with how it shows up in organizations. But if I just say that a business that's very centralized and top down, let's say, realizes that we just need to become more autonomous. And so they decide to change their structure and become autonomous business units. And a lot of people will resist that. And people who want to move it to autonomous business units need to listen to that resistance because there's some wisdom in it. Because the people who resist will say, hey, if you become totally autonomous, then you're going to miss the speed, you're going to miss the clarity, people are going to be all pulling in different directions. So don't do that. But let's say the organization does it. And for the initial 1, 2, 3 years, they get all the benefits of being autonomous. There's energy, there's innovation, there's greater responsiveness to the market. But now they've lost, they're not centralized, they're not top down anymore, they're decentralized. And in 3 to 4, 5, 10 years, they're going to begin to experience that, hey, we are now competing against each other. We don't all follow the same thing. We're not one culture. We're pulling in different directions. And we're now losing economies of scale. There's a lot of duplication going on. We need to centralize. And so the swing happens again. Usually organizational memories are short, partly because people have come and gone. And when that swing happens again, there will be resistance because the people who resist that are going to realize, hey, if you get back to centralized, we know what that's like. We've been there before. We want to keep this engagement and this responsiveness. So it's the responsibility of the people who are trying to push the organization into the other pole. It's their responsibility to listen to the wisdom in the resistance. So if both perspectives can do that, then you get an organization that has some integration, it has some centralization, and it also has some decentralization and some autonomy. And there's discernment about how to do when and what, which of these. And it's a constant dance. And that's where the learning actually comes in how can we be a more integrated organization. And some of that is happening anyway. Organizations also have that knowledge and capacity, but they just don't see it in certain contexts. And so making it explicit and showing in terms of the polarity thinking and showing the map and how this dynamic shows up is so illuminating. And just needs a little practice. And then it can be an internal guide that directs our thinking in more expansive, more masterful, more impactful, more comprehensive, more functional, less harmful ways.
Thank you. And yes, that dance between the centralized and the decentralized organizations, and you can see that the both and thinking could bring out the strengths of each and not going too far into the negative side of the polarities by being too tight and controlling, or by losing that sense of perhaps being one organization and working in an aligned way.
And the interesting thing is organizations are always cycling through this. Very smart people with a lot of money, a lot of funds, a lot of education behind them are still subject to the same dynamic and still subject to unconscious swings from one pole to the other.
It's interesting to hear how polarities show up at all these different levels, Beena, at the organisational level, the wider societal level, and at the individual level. And I'm curious how they might show up within the coach. Can you speak a little to what coaches might think about when it comes to polarity thinking?
Yeah. So before I go to the polarities that are relevant for the coaching practice, I would want to emphasize that within their coaching, no matter what certification, no matter what framework, no matter what practice a coach is bringing, to bring polarity thinking as a coaching tool would apply across all frameworks. And so that's something I would invite all coaches who are listening to really learn more about polarities, learn how polarities work, understand their own individual polarities as coaches, and then begin to notice where their clients are privileging a pole, where the client is over-focusing on a pole. And through coaching, you can help the client name the pole that is being neglected or the pole that they are identifying as negative or bad, and shifting that valuing for the client to see their own resistance, embracing the thing that they don't like, and to see the wisdom that is behind that pole. I think that would be the first thing I would ask coaches to do as practitioners. And then to think about coaches and what kinds of tensions coaches might be carrying. So one could be, for example, as a coach, am I being practice driven or am I being presence driven? Practice and presence is a polarity. I'll just call it that way. So a lot of coaches are focusing on the practice that they've learned. I do NLP coaching or I do this kind of coaching. And when they're doing a practice-based coaching, somehow the presence can be submerged. So they're all about the practice, but they're not actually present, bringing the self in as instrument. And then you see this, and this is the self-correction that happens in industries, in all fields of endeavor, that the field will push in one direction and then the other direction will get valued by somebody. And then you begin to see a push in that direction or a pull in that direction. So there's a lot happening on presence-based coaching in the last 15, 20 years. So you can see that initially there was a lot of practice-based coaching and then there's presence-based coaching. So I wonder if coaches are aware. So if I ask you, coaches who are listening, think for a moment, do you tend to focus more on the practice that you're bringing to the coaching? And how much do you allow your presence to do the coaching or to be the coaching process, if you will? So that's one thing you could think of. The other big one is support and stimulate. So I'm using the word stimulate instead of support and challenge, partly because I like SNS. So I like the polarities to sound, elegant. But support and challenge is a common polarity. So a lot of coaches choose support because they think that my job is to support you as the client. And for some coaches, challenging is interpreted as conflict. That if I'm challenging you, then I'm getting into a conflict with you and we're both sort of debating or we're against each other. And so challenge is difficult. Challenging the client is difficult.
Yeah.
And then there are some coaches that actually see their role as really stimulating the client and not being in their comfort zone and really asking them to go a little bit beyond what their current capability is or where their edges are. So again, coaches who are listening, I'm going to ask you, think about, do you tend to support your client more? When do you tend to challenge your client? Do you do it enough? And then how do you contextualize this? Because some clients actually need more support because they are more vulnerable. And some clients need more challenge because they are maybe in a status quo situation and they have the capacity to handle it. So now you're also thinking about not just the polarity, but also the context in which you're working with that polarity. I would also say that the other polarity is being goal-oriented and being emergent. So usually coaches are all about setting goals. What are the coaching goals? Having a good contract with the client and being clear about what the outcomes you want to achieve and what the goals are, and then measuring the progress towards the goals. So when you're focusing on the goals, you can miss something that's real in the moment, that's emergent. And you may not even see it if you're very goal-oriented. And goals change. If I'm coaching a client for 6-8 months, the goal that they started with has actually shifted. How alive are you as a coach to the fact that there is an emerging goal now? It's not the goal that we started with. And do you even ask that question? Of course, we have different styles also. Some coaches are more in the moment and what's coming up for you now. Some coaching schools emphasize that. So I would ask you, coaches who are listening, how goal-driven are you and how emergent are you in your coaching? And how well do you integrate being goal-driven and being emergent in your coaching? And I think these are all relevant polarities. I hope that those who are listening recognize that these are absolutely things that I'm playing with or I'm not very conscious about, but that are relevant to my practice. And there are so many more, but I'll point a couple more. Clients learning and my learning as a coach. So because we are coaches, we focus on our role and our job is that the client learns and grows. So do we see how we are learning and growing through our work with the client? And I don't mean A lot of coaches will focus on their own learning in terms of more coaching hours, more certifications, learning some new practice, learning a new framework. I'm not talking so much about that learning, but actually about the process of learning and growth and insights that is happening. And I think this may be in the experience of many people who are listening. I've had this experience where I walk away from a coaching experience with a client, and I think that's exactly what I needed. When I think about the advice that I'm giving or the suggestions or practices that I'm offering the client, I walk away thinking that's what I need. So I would ask you, those of you who are listening, how focused are you on the client's insights and what they are learning? And how open are you to seeing what you are learning from every coaching experience about what you need for your own growth and development? And along with this, how much am I learning? Along with this, I might say, how much am I resting in knowing and not knowing, which is a beautiful polarity to explore. As a coach, I'm seen as the resource. I'm seen as the one that knows. I'm seen as the one that's going to bring the solution, if you will, the direction, the guidance. And what is it like to sit in not knowing? How comfortable am I with not knowing? Can I offer not knowing as a pathway to my clients' learning? So there's so much around knowing and not knowing that is beautiful to explore. And embedded within the coaches advising and guiding and being a resource, there's a tendency for client-centered coaching schools to say that you follow the client, you don't direct, you don't advocate, you don't advise, you don't tell, you don't give solutions. This has to come from the client's own reflection, which I agree with and is great. And it's a polarity that I think coaches can manage better or can harmonize better when you recognize that often we are working with clients who are not used to reflecting the way we reflect as coaches. And they don't have the capacity yet to reflect. And if you now introduce the stages of vertical development, again, that concept, the idea, individuals at earlier stages are seeking direction. And in some ways, they need that direction to be able to get beyond looking to external authority. So we cannot assume that every client that comes really needs to be able to reflect on their own or can reflect on their own and have to be pushed beyond their conforming and relying on external authority. That's a needed step in the evolutionary process. So as coaches, when we gauge that the client is still coming into their own voice and they haven't yet come into their own voice, they don't even know their own voice. When we can gauge that, do we have the guts, I would say? Do we have the courage to stand and actually tell the client, I'm going to give you this homework. I want you to do this, and I want you to report back to me. Very few coaches will ever do that because we are so client-centered. And I'm saying that being client-centered or client-led and coach-led is a polarity, especially in developmental coaching, where we don't hesitate to give advice when the client is at a stage of development where that's what is orienting to them, that's meaningful, and that's what gives them the next step. Whereas if you go above their heads, then you're actually counterproductive as a coach because you're actually in some way stymieing them. They are stymied. They don't know how to go forward when you leave everything on them and say, what do you think? They're not very clear about that, which is why I might say that the empowerment movement in the whole of leadership and management development 2 decades ago failed because leaders were not in the self-authoring stage of development that they could be empowered.
Thank you. Beena, I thought there were some fantastic polarities there for coaches to think about. The polarity of practice and present, of support and stimulate, or what we might think of as challenge, the goal-oriented versus emergent, the client's learning versus what we are learning in that moment with the client, the resting in knowing and not knowing, and the client-centered and coach-centered polarity.
Yeah, and I want to highlight something, if you don't mind pointing out. You use the word versus.
Oh, did I? Sorry.
In a couple of them. No need to say so. This is important because this just reveals our conditioning. It reveals our conditioned language. It
Yes.
reveals a way we've been programmed without knowing it. We just naturally use it. So versus is either or mind, is the language of the either or mind. And is the language of the both and mind. And so it's just a call out that when you notice yourself, you hear yourself using the word versus, ask yourself, is this really an either or? Which there are. If I have two candidates and I have one job, it's either this or that candidate. It is this person versus this person, and I have to pick one over two. There might be some polarities I need to manage in that context, but that particular thing is not a polarity. That particular situation is a problem I need to solve. So problems you need to solve are very different from polarities that you need to manage. And so if all coaches listening here, if you can begin to notice the difference between versus and if you can replace in your language, when you're thinking about pairs where both are positive, both are needed over time, then use the word and.
Yeah, I agree. And this is something that I'm always consciously trying to do. And it's the same as using and instead of but. And it does require, as you've brought out there, and it does often require a conscious effort. And without consciously doing it, it's so easy to slip back into that language. So I think that's a really helpful call out, Beena.
Yeah. And celebrate when you discover it, not to feel bad, but to celebrate, oh, now that I see it. So every time you welcome the thing that you wish you hadn't said, every time you welcome it, it becomes something that becomes even clearer to you. So no need to say sorry.
Yes. And that does highlight something for me about the part of me that wants to get it right. And there's part of me that is constantly learning and growing and trying and experimenting.
Yes, absolutely.
And, hosting this podcast series has been a part of that journey as well. So, yeah, thank you.
That's a beautiful naming in the moment of your own polarity. That's beautiful. I appreciate that.
Thank you, Beena. So we're coming towards the end of the podcast. I'd love you to share a little bit in a moment about where people might get in touch with you and learn more, and then perhaps end with a question of some final thoughts for a coach to take away on how they might just start bringing a little bit of this into, even if it's just the awareness, into their coaching. So yeah, where can people learn more about you, Beena? You and your work?
Oh, just on our website, which we're already working on having a new website soon, but it's functional. So our website is Vertical Development Academy. Along with the resources and the show notes, there will be a link for you to click on for a program that we're doing on polarities early next year, which you can sign up for and learn to practice. And in 2024, I'm excited to be launching a public program just for coaches on first understanding polarities and then practicing them for oneself as an individual, and then how to use polarities to coach others. So we'll be announcing that program. So stay tuned. If you have anything specific that you loved about this, you can write to me at beena@verticaldevelopment.com. You can also write and just let me know you're interested to be put on our list. I don't mind receiving emails. I have support. My colleague will pick up your name and put it on the list. There is a visual image that captures this dynamic between the poles that I've shared, which will be in the show notes that you can take a look at. I think I will also add an article there that I've written on polarities and vertical development you might find interesting. And if you're interested in vertical development, then definitely do get in touch with us. We are training and certifying coaches in understanding the stages of maturity and how to support and stimulate people as they grow through different stages of development. We will be having a coach training next year. You can reach out to me on LinkedIn under my name, Beena Sharma, and I look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Beena. And I very much hope and believe that some of the coaches listening to this will take you up on those offers and want to learn and explore more about polarities. So yeah, I'd love if you could share just a few thoughts for listeners to take away on how they might start to bring greater awareness for polarities into their coaching. Just a few tips.
Yeah. And thank you for this opportunity to even share our resources. I appreciate that. So I would invite you to first really be fascinated, with this idea of polarities and begin to see them play inside you. Begin to notice the things that you love, the things that you push away from. I would say as an individual, if you notice that you don't like a person because they have a certain quality, I would like you to be open to the fact that there's a polarity there and that you might be privileging one pole and neglecting another. And give you my example. So my husband, sometimes I feel, is too passive. And it's a continuous lesson for me because I tend to be assertive and I tend to take so much initiative that I find that when he's not taking initiative, he's passive. But it's taking me time to recognize that he's not passive as much as he's responsive. He doesn't take initiative, but he's responsive. He's not passive. So changing my judgment of him and seeing him more as a responsive human being rather than a passive human being is more respectful. It's more dignifying and it's more appreciative. And now we can have a conversation about it. And it also tells me that I can learn how to be less assertive and just more responding. And when I'm more responsive, then he becomes more taking the initiative. So see, it's a beautiful dynamic that happens between individuals.
Yeah.
So I'd love for you to see this dynamic between you and people you love, people in your family, your colleagues. How are you noticing this push and pull of different qualities, things that you love, things that you don't like? So that's the first thing I would like you to start noticing. And then the second thing is notice when this happens with your clients. Notice when they reject something. Notice when they're pushing towards something. What might they be neglecting? What might sort of slip into the shadow that they're not quite aware of? And how might you be an integrative force for your client? And how might you not push them in the other direction, but invite them into the vulnerability and the discomfort of sitting in something that's not unfamiliar? And how might you help them design experiments for themselves to explore? So for me, it's an experiment to not be so assertive and just to be responding and to just wait. That's an experiment for me. So like that. And then I would say definitely this should become part of your skill set. I mean, wherever you go, it would be great if you came to learn with us, but there are many resources offering polarity thinking. So I think this is a must-have tool in your toolkit. And it's more than a tool, in my view. It's not just a tool.
Yeah, it seems to me like a way of thinking that may be a lifelong journey, but it's integral, really. Yeah, thank you.
You're so welcome.
Beena, it's been absolutely delightful speaking with you today. I've really appreciated your wisdom and knowledge in this area. So thank you very, very much for joining us.
Oh, thank you for inviting me. And like I said, this is my most favorite thing to do. And the time went by really fast. And I appreciate your interest and your commitment. So thank you.
Thank you for listening to another podcast by the Association for Coaching. For over 20 years, our purpose has been to inspire and champion coaching excellence, advance the coaching profession, and make a sustainable difference to individuals, organisations and society. To find out more about the AC and our member benefits, follow us on LinkedIn or visit our webpage at associationforcoaching.com. Explore our new digital learning hub and enjoy our extensive library of on-demand webinars, signature programs, member benefits, interviews, podcasts, and a portfolio of live events featuring thought leadership, tools, models, and the latest industry trends to help you develop and increase your coaching expertise.